Hello! Today I'm taking a break from my Final Fantasy miniseries on the evolution of the summons to focus on something a little more topical, with a look at the latest reveals, trailers, and information on the upcoming Final Fantasy XVI. Now, it's something of an irony, off the back of discussing the summons recently, to recall just how increasingly important to mainline Final Fantasy stories they actually seem to be. And those familiar with the channel may recall that some time ago I had an episode documenting the evolution of the Final Fantasy summons and the increasing prominence that they have in the games today, from starting out as mere battle assets to becoming these domineering god-type figures in recent years. And so, turning to Final Fantasy XVI now, it's fascinating to see how they've evolved even further from these externalized guardians to be bargained with and obtained, to become elements of the story that integrate directly with human counterparts. And more so than ever before, they appear to be acknowledged by, and indeed the avatars of, civilization, and these factional disputes between different countries and tribes that appear to be populating this new Final Fantasy world. So I'll be taking a look at that over the course of the episode, along with some other bits that we've glimpsed so far, including gameplay, characters and setting, and indeed the varying responses to these from different audiences. But continuing with summons for a moment, this is an interesting consideration because, as is often the case, their role in a game has implications on both gameplay mechanics and story. And what we know so far about the game is that the summonable icons are appended to individual characters, such as Joshua, Hugo, Benedicta, and so on. And so, contrary to traditional Final Fantasies, where we are often collecting a multitude of summons for an individual, such as Yuna's Pilgrimage Quest or Noctis's Pilgrimage Quest in 15, or simply acquiring them in optional side quests, such as in Final Fantasy VIII, where we are drawing them from certain locations and certain enemies. Summons have almost always been something obtained and utilised by the party for narrative progression and gameplay advantage. However, Final Fantasy XVI's fractured setting, where summons are sprawled across different factions and individuals, creates an interesting situation where this tradition of collecting all of the summons may play out in an entirely different way. So, there's a few ways that this could play out, and without knowing the specifics of lore and story, we could assume that either A, we wind up with a conventional fellowship party, whether they're NPC or playable or whatever, that are able to channel or utilise the summons, or B, and much more likely, is Clive and or a playable equivalent is able to personally channel or obtain the icon's power, or an equivalent icon's power, as the trailers strongly indicate. Or then we have C, which would be that there's simply a limited use, or at least a limited access to certain summons for the player to personally engage with. And so, to summarise, it remains to be seen if either yes, the summons continue to be acquirable battle assets, or no, that they transition to become more like obstacles to overcome in the story. But as I say, Clive's gameplay seems to hint at multiple summons kind of influencing his battle abilities and attacks and so on. So whether he himself has significance as a dominant or a unique equivalent summoner power, or whether, for example, the apparent Dark Ifrit that we saw in the trailer hints at the recurring Final Fantasy trope of light and dark duality and doppelgangers, such as the Dark Aeons we saw in Final Fantasy X, or the Dark Crystals that we saw in Final Fantasy IV, which would mean that there is a multitude and perhaps a duology of all of the individual summons we see. Or simply whether, like the Paramagic in Final Fantasy VIII, Clive manages to channel these abilities from another source. So all of that remains to be seen. But it's quite an interesting bit of speculation that's been going on among fans of the games. And generally speaking, I think it's quite an interesting recalibration of how we perceive the summons in a Final Fantasy title to operate. Now, regarding the story, there's again some interesting speculation going on here, and what I think it's prudent to bear in mind is how Final Fantasy games traditionally unfold, which is to say, there's a personal arc for the hero to resolve, and then there's the macro world-endangering crisis to resolve that usually reconciles at a single point or with a single villain or character. And Square tend to do this very well, and they overlap them to bring them to a single conclusion. So for example, Tidus' dilemma with Jecht and the defeat of Sin is a fantastic example of that single endpoint, and Cloud's defeat of Sephiroth while saving the planet from Meteor is another great example, because it resolves his personal issues and saves the world. And so we can see from Final Fantasy XVI so far that the foundations for these personal and macro stories are beginning to emerge. We have a world in crisis, with warring factions, scarce resources, and a mysterious blight being just some of the issues that have been touched on. But we also have Clive, who we see transition from an affable young man to a very grizzled, vengeful-looking warrior type in what's clearly a time jump. And it's already been suggested that Final Fantasy XVI is, to some degree or another, a story of revenge. And on this note, a lot of the implications of the trailer have led fans to believe that the revenge tragedy may stem from his younger brother Joshua, who was the Phoenix dominant, being killed by an Ifrit. And there's certainly some dramatic footage that seems to attest to that, along with the fact we glimpse Clive as an adult, but not his younger brother. But for me personally, I feel like there could be a bit more to it than that, and perhaps, maybe yes, Joshua does die, prompting Clive's revenge, but the Phoenix persists as such a prominent aspect of the game that we've seen so far, including being on the logo. I think maybe some aspect of Joshua would channel through or live on through Clive to propel that personal arc forwards, or maybe the Phoenix just purely transfers to him. Or alternatively, I wouldn't be surprised if Joshua in fact doesn't die, because the Phoenix symbolises resurrection, after all. And just thinking about Final Fantasy's history of dualities and historic relationships existing between hero and villain, whether it's Tidus and Jecht being father and son, or Sesso and Golbez being brothers in Final Fantasy IV, I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that Joshua might re-emerge as some sort of villain when he grows up, based on whatever's happened to him in that quite dramatic sequence. And indeed, if that's not the case, then there's also the adopted sister Jill to think about too, who likewise may partake in or be the victim of some form of betrayal that prompts the hero-villain sort of reactions to occur. And both of those suggestions, they may be nonsense, but considering the historic trend of Final Fantasy heroes and villains sharing a common and often family bond in most of the mainline games, it can't necessarily be discounted based on the trailers and the stuff we've seen so far. And again, just looking at the logo, it appears to be a Phoenix fighting an Ifrit. So whoever those representative characters are, I think may inform a lot about this story and where it's heading. So moving on, we've looked at how the summons influence battle mechanics in the story. And let's shift a little more into gameplay now, with another contentiously discussed aspect of Final Fantasy XVI, which is whether or not it has party members, or is a solo adventure focused exclusively on Clive. Now, if you'd asked me a year ago, I would say that a non-MMO Final Fantasy that only features one playable character would be improbable. However, if we look at the UI design of the game so far, and particularly the positioning and prominence of the health bar, this lends to the idea that this is a single character game, because there's no obvious way to stack or display a party member health and status, from that position. And even if the additional non-selected character bars were minified or something like that, it would drastically obscure the actual usable area of the screen. And to change the UI pattern after acquiring party members would be just really poor design, because you've established design patterns and then you're breaking them. So for me, it feels unlikely at this stage that there will be party members, or at least playable ones, that we can influence. And while there was a point that I thought they were showing character avatars up near the health bar, on closer inspection these are actually summon portraits. And for example, Odin and Shiva seem to be there, and we can see the player is switching between these to channel different battle abilities that are specific to these summons, such as Odin's Gungnir and so on. So it seems to be a single character game, which is very uncharacteristic for a Final Fantasy, though it's not impossible that they will do scenario switching in the game between past and present, and maybe different characters, such as they've done in earlier Final Fantasies, where you will briefly take control of Barret or Aerith in 7, or Steiner or Marcus in 9. But I would be very surprised if we were to play the entirety of Final Fantasy XVI from one character's perspective, even accounting for the fact it's been developed by the MMO people, because the Fellowship is arguably part of the fabric of Final Fantasy, and even though every Final Fantasy is different and they are only loosely associated by specific consistent elements, the Fellowship quest has been a cornerstone of the titles since the very first game, and not to feature that in some form or another I think would be quite divisive for a lot of fans, and particularly legacy fans of these titles. And I suppose on that note, the way I look at Final Fantasy beyond the chronology of the games is that the significant entries can be loosely grouped three ways, with the first of these being the conventional Final Fantasy, 7, 8, 9, 10, and those prior to it, which you could pin to Hironobu Sakaguchi and Yoshinori Kitase. And then we have the Matsuno Ivalice games, which is 12, Tactics, and Vagrant Story, those sort of games. And then we have the MMOs, which is 11 and 14. And looking at the personnel working on these respective categories, looking at the approaches to gameplay and story, we can see how they differentiate. And I think if we had a Venn diagram of the three, Final Fantasy XVI sits much more in the realm of the MMOs and the Ivalice approach than the mainline Fellowship style of games that would be Sakaguchi's legacy, I would say. And I think there's been some conflicted reactions towards this, which, along with the more action-centric gameplay and the demise of the ATB battle system, a lot of fans, and particularly those, as I say, that had their formative experience being that era of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they don't recognise it anymore. And without the Fellowship quest, without the ATB and the world map and the vehicles, they don't have anything to point to and say, that's what makes it Final Fantasy. So, I do understand that sentiment, but also I remember feeling that way when they released Final Fantasy X without a world map, and that's gone on to become one of my favourite games in the series. And I also remember disliking the intensive mechanics of Final Fantasy Tactics, and that's gone on to become one of my favourites in the series, because while it's subjective, what I prioritise in Final Fantasy games is storycraft and characters over most of those other elements to a greater or lesser degree. And if they nail that, then I can forgive unfamiliar gameplay or linearity to a certain degree. And personally, sorry, just to wrap up on this tangent, if Square want to push the envelope with their mainline series and step more furtively into Western game mechanics and so on, I'm kind of fine with that. But I am quite amazed that they haven't set up a business unit to focus exclusively on developing Golden Age style Final Fantasy games with ATBs and that sort of thing, because for over a decade, and I can recall when Final Fantasy XII came out, people have been sort of reacting badly towards it and the direction of the series. So there's certainly a market for it, and I'm sure it wouldn't be that labour intensive. But anyway, let's get back to Final Fantasy XVI. And what we've seen is a lot of glimpses of both gameplay and story, which have been speculated upon, and there's been some really interesting theories that have already started emerging out of that, which I love to see. But looking finally at setting, and I suppose looping back to that theoretical Venn diagram, this is where the game is reminding me of the Ivalice titles, because where Sakaguchi games historically focused on extraterrestrial or supernatural villains endangering the world and evil empires and so on, the Ivalice games focus on very human problems and human conflicts. They are nuanced and politicised. And as we saw with characters like Delita in Tactics, or Vayne in 12, there's much more debate around how arbitrarily virtuous or evil the heroes and villains actually are. So if they went down this route, perhaps where Clive could be perceived as a tragic antagonist by some, and whoever the ultimate villain is could be considered as having elements of virtue, then that could make for an interesting story. And these warring countries operating in shades of grey, rather than having one arbitrarily evil empire, as is historically the case, I think that could be where this game is heading, based on my initial impression. So, personally, I like that. A lot of people have lamented that the game looks like Game of Thrones, which is amusing because that used to be a positive connotation, but since that conclusion, it's now become a negative. But I do agree in the sense that there needs to be a balance between action and exposition if it does become a more political story. Because one of the detractions of Final Fantasy XII for a lot of people was that it was a lot of dialogue, it was a lot of Republican versus monarchy bickering and stuff like that. And they kind of got turned off from that, and they felt Vayne was a bit flat because most of his villainy came from political manoeuvring rather than killing people. And I suppose on that, and another final comment, which is less around setting but more around characters, there has been some early criticism around the perceived lack of obvious female leads in this game, which some have argued is a regressive step. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's too early to say, because more often than not, a Final Fantasy lead in the older games is a love interest, and while they are often well developed as characters, that is the remit of their inclusion to some degree or another. So while there is no clear love interest in Final Fantasy XVI, I don't think that points to underrepresentation. We have seen characters like Benedicta, who will likely play a prominent role in the story, and she looks pretty cool and battle-hardened, so it will be interesting to see how her arc unfolds and how much representation these sorts of characters get, as opposed to the established conventions of the series. So that about wraps up my thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI so far. I think they've done a great job with the trailers, because they've really fueled expectations, and perhaps setting the expectations too for fans who were speculating about the action gameplay and the party members and so on. So without a doubt, it's a new direction and a more furtive step away from that golden age of Final Fantasy, but the potential for a character-driven revenge tale, politically dubious factions, and epic summon battles, it's definitely caught my attention, and I'm really interested to see where it goes. So if you have your own thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI so far, feel free to drop a comment to theorise, critique or discuss. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider giving me a like and a subscribe, and check the description below for other ways you can support the channel.